صباح الخير جميعا، أهلا وسهلا بكم. نرحب بكم رئيس المعهد الدكتور عبد الوهاب الأفندي، أعضاء مجلس الأمناء المحترمين، الزميلات والزملاء من الكادرين الإداري والأكاديمي، طالباتنا وطلابنا في معهد الدوحة وضيوفنا الكرام، مرحبا بكم جميعا كل باسمه ولقبه. تحمل هذه المحاضرة الافتتاحية لهذا العام طابعا مميزا تتزامن مع احتفال المعهد بمرور 10 سنوات على تأسيسه. 10 سنوات شهدنا فيها تحول فكرة طموحة إلى مشروع عربي أكاديمي نهضوي رائد. طبعا جرت العادة في هذا الوقت من كل عام أن يستضيف المعهد مفكرا بارزا يشتغل على قضايا راهنة تهم الجمهور والأكاديمية معا، لإلقاء المحاضرة الافتتاحية التي أصبحت تقليدا راسخا يؤكد الزام المعهد بتعزيز التفاعل الفكري والتواصل مع المجتمع. ويسعدني هذا العام أن نستضيف البروفيسور أندريه ليفتشينكو لإلقاء هذه المحاضرة، طبعا سأعرف عنه لاحقا باللغة الإنجليزية، حيث يتناول موضوع الحروب التجارية من منظور تاريخي مسلطا الضوء على الحرب الدائرة اليوم وتبعاتها المحتملة. طبعا قبل قرابة 10 أشهر عندما تواصلت مع الدكتور أندريه لإلقاء المحاضرة، فسألته عن موضوع المحاضرة فحكى لي الحروب التجارية. فأنا جوابي له: هل أنت متأكد؟ لأنه هذا قبل 10 أشهر، وأنا كنت أتوقع كاقتصادي إنه تهديدات ترامب هي لا تتجاوز طبعا حدود الخطاب السياسي، وأنه في النهاية ترامب سوف يخضع لقوى السوق كاقتصادي، وبالتالي لن يحدث أي حروب تجارية. فكنت أتوقع أنه من هون لموعد المحاضرة سوف تكون الحروب التجارية قد انتهت. فطبعا الدكتور ليفتشينكو أجابني بهدوء: سنرى. وبطبيعة الحال هو كان على صواب وأنا كنت مخطئ، ما زالت الحروب التجارية قائمة. أنا أتوقع أنه ما نشهده اليوم من حروب تجارية هو ليس انعكاس لرغبات ترامب الشخصية وحبه للضرائب والتعرفة الجمركية زي ما كنا عارفين. هي تعبير عن تحول أعمق برأيي هو أيديولوجي وسياسي نحو الانغلاق والشعبوية. ولكن المفاجأة هون أنه الأسواق المالية ما زالت تحقق مكاسب هائلة، الاقتصاد العالمي ما زال متمسك، معدلات النمو ما زالت مرتفعة نوعا ما. فهون وخاص يعني نحن بنحكي عن أشهر بعد يوم التحرير المشهور، ولكن ما زال هناك في تماسك. بالأمس I think أسواق الأسهم الأمريكية حققت مكاسب ريكورد، يعني هي خيالية. فهنا سؤال مهم: هل الاقتصاديين كانوا على خطأ؟ أو بمعنى بتوقعاتهم لآثار الحروب التجارية على الاقتصاد؟ هم دائما بخطئوا، كثير بخطئوا، ولكن هنا سؤال مهم والدكتور ليفتشينكو سوف يجيبنا عليه نوعا ما. طيب أنا بسعدني أرحب بالدكتور ليفتشينكو. أنا ما بدي أحكي عن الموضوع كثير لأنه لو كملنا بالموضوع فهون لا تسمع من الدكتور ليفتشينكو. Andrei Levchenko is John W. Sweetland Professor of International Economics at the University of Michigan. He is the co-editor of the American Economic Review, one of the oldest and most prestigious journal in economics, and the director of International Trade and Macroeconomics Program of the Central Bank Research Association. He is also a research associate at the National Bureau of Economic Research and a research fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research. Previously, he was an economist at the International Monetary Fund from 2004 to 2009, and editor-in-chief of the IMF Economic Review from 2021 to 2025. And he has held visiting positions at the University of Chicago, Lausanne, and Zurich. He received his PhD in economics from MIT in 2004. He is widely recognized for his influential work on how institutions shape global trade patterns and for his important research on how trade affects economic volatility, including his analysis of the sharp collapse of world trade during the 2008 financial crisis. His work has had a major impact on the field of international economics. His research has been funded by several agencies, including the US National Science Foundation and the UK Department of International Development, and has appeared in a variety of journals, including American Economic Review, Econometrica, Journal of Political Economy, Quarterly Journal of Economics, Review of Economic Studies, and Proceeding of National Academy of Science. Join me to welcome Dr. Andrei Lيفتشينكو for this opening lecture.
Thank you very much, Ayhab, for this kind introduction. It's an honor and a pleasure to be here to help celebrate Doha Institute's 10th anniversary. So happy birthday! Congratulations on all the achievement in the past decade. And it's a special pleasure because I'm a scholar of globalization, and the Gulf region. There's no region in the world that has embraced openness to the world as much as the Gulf. So I have been telling all the international economists that would listen that you cannot really fully understand globalization and what it can do until you have visited the Gulf. So it's a pleasure to be back in the region, and I feel very at home here. So it is no exaggeration to say that we live on a cusp of two historical eras. There's many ways of measuring international openness, but here's one that is widely used, which is the trade to GDP ratio. So it's on here, but not on there. It was up earlier, right? Yeah. And then somehow. So while this comes on, the era between the end of World War II and roughly the first Trump administration is the era of globalization, which is an era of increasing trade openness and openness to other aspects of interaction like capital flows or migration. And this era received its first shock during the 2008 global financial crisis that witnessed the great trade collapse, where global trade fell by something like 15 percentage points in 6 months. And once we see the picture, we will see that it's sort of never quite recovered after that. It's increasing trend, so it was on a stable trend after that. There it is. Okay. So now it's not the same as here. It keeps jumping. Sorry. All right. So as you see, trade was increasing for decades as a fraction of GDP. No, this is good. This is appropriate now. From the beginning of this picture until about 2008, and there are many reasons for this, and some of them are certainly technological. In particular, an important invention was the invention of the shipping container. But really, a lot of this globalization, this increase in trade as a fraction of economic activity, was driven by a policy stance towards greater openness. At the end of World War II, the world economy featured high barriers to trade. And starting with the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade in 1947, the leading countries in the world came together and negotiated reductions in these policy barriers to trade in successive rounds. And in different parts of the world, there were other developments, policy developments, where countries deliberately got together and agreed on greater openness. For example, in 1956, the embryo of the European Union was founded among 6 countries, and the European Union grew from 6 countries to 27 over this period between 1956 and now. The United States and Mexico and Canada signed an important trade agreement in 1994. The Iron Curtain fell in the late 80s and early 90s, and they brought the emerging giant economies like the Soviet bloc countries, but also China and India into the world economy. And so for many decades, the world was opening up, and there was a pro-openness policy stance that helped the world become closely integrated. So the first shock, as I mentioned, was the Great Recession and the Great Trade Collapse. This is this blip down. And then at the time, we couldn't have really known what was going to happen and how trade was going to behave. Initially, it recovered quickly to its pre-recession levels, but then you could see that the growth of international trade had stopped at that point. So we can all kind of take this figure and benchmark it to our own lifetime. So I was born in 1977 in the Soviet Union, a closed society that was not really open to the world, or at least was open to the world selectively. And I lived through the opening up of the Soviet bloc countries. I moved to the US. I went to grad school. I was in my early 30s when the Great Trade Collapse happened. And I was almost 40 when the first Trump administration got elected. And so for somebody like me whose entire lifetime was this trend towards greater openness, it might feel like this is a natural state of the world and this is how it's always going to be. And I've certainly personally benefited tremendously from this increase in openness and the fact that I could live in different countries and experience knowledge from many different sources in many different countries. But yet it turned out, to my surprise, frankly, that this isn't the natural state of the world, right? The first shock to this overall stance towards openness that occurred was 2016, when in the same 6 months, Britain voted to leave the European Union, and Trump was elected for the first time. And then a few years later, the Russia-Ukraine war broke out, and that severed a number of important economic links. For example, the links between, or at least many of the links between Russia and Western countries. And then in 2025, the second Trump administration came to power, and at least from the US perspective, the pro-openness policy stance has definitively ended. So here's the representative headline, but obviously there are many. Staggering US tariffs begin as Trump widens the trade war, and there's a map of the world that's color-coded to essentially how high the tariffs are going to be against those countries. one notable difference between the Trump 2025 and Trump 2017 is that Trump 2017 was largely targeted at China, whereas Trump 2025 has broadened the anti-trade stance towards essentially the entire world. So let me go to the punchline first. I think that tariffs are bad for the world. Probably you won't be surprised that I think that. But it takes more than a couple of sentences to explain why. Actually, it probably takes me a whole lecture to explain exactly why tariffs are bad, because there's all kinds of interesting subtleties that come up. And so the plan for the lecture would be, first, just kind of for fun, present a brief history of tariffs. And that is going to be to argue that actually the low tariff regime of the past few decades is a historical exception rather than the rule. Tariffs have been ubiquitous historically, going back millennia. And what is really unique and to me great and very beneficial was this globalization regime of the second half of the 20th century. Then I will discuss why countries may want to put on tariffs, and there are several economic rationales that countries may want to do that at least superficially appear beneficial to the countries. And then I will finally present the economic case against tariffs that is going to start from this premise that selfishly perhaps countries may want to impose tariffs, but ultimately it becomes self-defeating. So what is a tariff, first of all? A tariff is a tax on the act of crossing the border, a customs border. When preparing this lecture, I was delighted to learn that actually the word tariff is Arabic in origin. Perhaps you all knew that, but I didn't, even though I've been an international trade economist for 20 years. It comes from an Arabic word tarifa, which means to inform, and tarif was a table of fees. So it's a notice, a table of fees to be paid, presumably when crossing this border. And the word arrived in Europe via medieval traders in the 10th and 11th centuries and made its way through European languages, first Italian, then French and English. There is a tremendous amount of evidence of tariffs in the historical record. So we can go all the way back to the second millennium before Common Era to find tariffs in ancient Assyria that imposed duties levied at city gates. Ancient Rome had a well-established tariff that applied throughout its empire called the portorium, which was a tax collected at ports that was somewhere in the order of 2.5% to 5%, but it also featured some much higher tariffs in different locations. For example, there was a tax called tetarte on goods entering Egypt through the Red Sea that was 25%. And this is a Roman relief of a tariffs being collected. Another piece of evidence we have on tariffs is these stelae here, which are called the Palmyra tariff. They come from year 200 in the Common Era. Palmyra is of course, as you all know, a city in modern Syria. And the stelae, which are incidentally in the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, where they have been since 1901, they are a list of taxes to be paid. And here are some examples here of the different types of products, and there are many, right? All of these stelae are full of these writings. So for either exporting or importing different types of items, a load of olive oil, a load of animal fat, goat skins, etc. This is a list of the payments to be made. In the Islamic world, there was a very important tariff called ushur or ushur, which was put in place by Caliph Umar in the 7th century. And it was present throughout the Islamic lands from Spain to India from the 7th all the way to the 18th century. There's a very detailed account by Ibn al-Mujawir in his travelogue, which is this great name of Chronicle of an Intelligent Observer. We should all be intelligent observers, I think. That details the customs procedures in the city of Aden in the 13th century. And it was a very elaborate process that has several stages. So there was a customs office in which professional customs officials were involved in the process. And the arrival of the ship was signaled already by people on the lookout. And so by the time the ship arrived in the harbor, the customs officials were ready. And the first stage was to board the ship before it had docked, to receive a bill of lading for all the goods present on the ship, and also to get a list of all the individuals on board. Then after that was returned to the customs inspector, the ship was authorized to dock, but they still couldn't unload the goods. Instead, a different inspection team came on board that included both male and female officials and searched the persons of everybody on board to make sure there was no contraband involved. Only then were the goods allowed to disembark into the harbor, and the customs official then went item by item, recording everything that was unloaded and putting the customs duties on the items. So it was a drawn out process that took 3 days. According to Ibn al-Mujawir, at the end of this process, ill fortune strikes the merchant, sadness all but kills him, and his fate takes an evil turn because of what customs officials do to drive away from him the prosperity and happiness. So even in the 13th century, there were tariffs and they were stressful for the merchants involved. Ibn al-Mujawir actually made a map of the Aden harbor and made a list of the duties on 34 items that were applied at the Aden customs office. And you can see here all the different items: clove, cardamom, camphor, darwa wood, perfumed cherry bark, etc. The feeling was that these were just a small selection, and in fact, the customs authorities at that time were imposing customs duties on all kinds of items beyond what Ibn al-Mujawir has listed. Jumping very abruptly to the modern era, here are the tariffs in the United States from 1820 to the present day. And what I want you to see in this picture is that this era at the very, very right of low tariffs that we all have lived through since the 70s and 80s is actually a significant historical aberration relative to the tariffs that were prevalent for the nearly 180 years before that, right? So United States had historically significant tariffs, somewhere in the order of 20 to 40% historical averages, whereas starting in the 80s, it was in the single digits, maybe between 2 and 4%. And then it's hard to compile these data comprehensively for the whole world, but people that have tried ended up reaching a similar conclusion. So in this graph, the blue is still the US tariff, and then the red is the world average tariff. Obviously, again, it's very hard to come up with a world average tariff. You're averaging all kinds of countries, all kinds of goods, and so on. But you see that before the world wars, they were higher. They were even higher in the between the two world wars. And then the post-war era has featured this long downward trend in average tariffs. But again, the low tariffs that we experienced recently are really a historical exception. Okay, so that's what I want to end with here. That in a sense, low tariffs are a rarity. And then now I want to move on to why countries might want to impose tariffs, and eventually argue why that's not a good idea. There are several reasons for the countries may want to impose tariffs. There are some reasons that have to do with the failures of the political process domestically. So, for example, things like special interest groups capturing the government's attention and using the government to impose tariffs to protect their own economic interest. I'm going to set aside the reasons that are not, from a whole country's perspective, welfare enhancing. I'm going to focus only on the reasons that a country, even if it had a benevolent government and looked at the welfare of all its citizens, would still want to impose tariffs. So one reason that I will mention, because I think it's quite important and set aside, is revenue generation. Tariffs have been used and are so ubiquitous historically, in part because they are the most easily collectible tax, right? So tariffs, so international trade naturally passes through bottlenecks. These are things like harbors, mountain passes, city gates, major roads, etc., which makes it easy to tax. And other things, especially in kind of pre-modern societies, without statistical offices and so on, would have been harder to tax. Sorry, this is the Trump tariffs in 2025 in historical perspective. You see that basically now they're as high as they were in the 1930s during the Great Depression. So this is my favorite example of this bottleneck phenomenon. On the right of the graph is the Chillon Castle, which is a castle on the eastern tip of Lake Léman in Switzerland. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. You should visit it. It's really strikingly beautiful. It's a castle on the lake. And when you go there and you start reading the fine print of why that castle was there and so on, you realize that actually this is a garrison for a customs house. On the left here is the map of Via Francigena, which is the main pilgrimage and trade route overland from Italy to Northern Europe, like Germany and France. And you see that it went from Italy. At some point, it had to cross the Alps, which it did in the St. Bernard Pass. And then it went north by Lake Léman and then onwards to France and Germany. In the middle is the area of the Chillon Castle that is zoomed in. And you see this is the St. Bernard Pass. And the route went down the mountains and into the Rhone Valley. And at some point, it gets to this spot where there's sheer mountains on one side, there's a lake on another, and then there's a narrow passage through which this major road from Italy to Germany and France had to pass. So it was a bottleneck that was unavoidable. To go around in any direction would have been very hard. which was a perfect spot to put a customs office and start collecting rents, start collecting tariffs on this trade. So this was actually one of the key sources of strength of the Dukes of Savoy, which controlled this area, and it made the state quite powerful. Then it was a dynasty that became rulers of the kingdoms of Sardinia, and eventually of all of Italy, back when Italy unified and was a monarchy initially. So historically, tariffs were there to an important extent because it was easy to tax, but these days it is not a big reason to put tariffs, because except for perhaps the poorest countries in the world, most countries now have the state capacity to tax other things besides international trade. So this is the picture of the fraction of U.S. federal tax revenue that's due to tariffs, and you see that back in the 19th century it was nearly 100%. So up until the U.S. Civil War in the 1860s, almost all of U.S. tax revenue was collected through tariffs. Then they introduced excise taxes, and that fraction fell to 50%, which is still quite significant, right? And then what really eliminated tariffs as an important source of tax revenue was the introduction of the income tax in 1913. So once the US state developed the capacity to tax things other than international trade stopped being important as a source of revenue. So we're gonna set that revenue considerations aside and move on to other kind of more economic reasons why a country might want to tax international trade. One important economic argument to do it is the so-called terms of trade argument. When a country taxes its imports, it actually lowers the price that it pays for the imports, right? So any tax that you put is going to fall in part on the seller and in part on the buyer, right? So if you put a tax on something, that could be, you know, income, or it could be a sales tax or VAT tax or anything like that, two things will happen. One is that the price that the buyer buys increases, and then the second one is that the price that the seller, at which the seller sells, is going to fall to make room for the tax that then the government receives. An import tax is somewhat unique in that the seller is a foreign entity whose welfare as a domestic policymaker I don't care about. And so the fact that the seller is now receiving a lower price for their items doesn't concern me at all. I benefit from the fact that as a country now I pay less for my imports. And so up to a certain point, I may want to exploit that and put a tariff on my imports. So sometimes this is called the optimal tariff argument. And it's really an interior optimum, right? So in this diagram, we plot the welfare of the importing country that is putting the tariff against the level of the tariff, right? So if we're all the way to the right, the tariff is very high and it's prohibitive, so there's no trade, and we are at this welfare here. If we have zero tariff, then we have completely free trade, and the free trade welfare is higher than the no trade welfare because we benefit from international trade. But in the middle, this curve goes up. So for a while, if your tariffs are low, you can improve your welfare by increasing the tariff, and then welfare is maximized. That's something called the optimal tariff. If you push it further further higher, then welfare is going to start to fall. But there's an optimal level that is going to maximize domestic welfare. So we might ask, what is that level? It turns out that that level is pretty high. Different estimates put it somewhere in the range of 20 to 60%, depending on the circumstances, right? So US average tariff of 16% has not even reached the optimal level yet. At least according to, again, the numbers that we can calculate. There are other reasons. So one important one is infant industry protection. That actually goes all the way back to 1840s to a treatise by a German economist called List, this is the quote: "It's true that protective duties at first increased the price of manufactured goods, but in the course of time, the nation being unable to build up a completely developed manufacturing power of its own, those goods are produced more cheaply at home than the price at which they can be imported from foreign parts." So it's an old argument that essentially says that if we have a domestic industry that currently cannot withstand international competition, but if we were to be allowed to produce, it would become more productive and grow tremendously, and then eventually we'll be able to produce goods more cheaply and withstand foreign competition, then that could be an argument for temporarily putting tariffs on imports to let the domestic industry develop. This is actually a tremendously influential argument in real-world policy. Many, many countries in the 60s, 70s, and 80s engaged in what is sometimes referred to as the import substitution industrialization, where they tried to develop their own domestic manufacturing industry behind the protective barrier of import tariffs. It mostly didn't work, although there are industrial policy kind of more broadly has had some successes in some countries. Finally, a more modern argument was made by Venables in the 80s, and it goes by the name manufacturing delocation. And the idea is that if we face trade costs, then there is some benefit from having the manufacturing sector in our country. It could be because the consumers enjoy having a greater variety of manufacturing goods, and so having them domestically means that we don't have to pay trade costs to import them. Or it could be because there are some increasing returns or some economies of scale in the manufacturing sector that the bigger is the manufacturing sector, the more productive it is, and the cheaper is its output, which benefits consumers. And so in that kind of environment where there's some reason we might want to have a manufacturing sector in our home country, it will also be optimal to impose tariffs in order to delocate the manufacturing sector to our own country. So this actually sounds a lot like what Trump says. I'm kind of surprised that Trump, to my knowledge at least, has never cited Venables, but maybe you should read those papers. All right, so now I went through a bunch of reasons why a country may want to put tariffs that is going to be welfare enhancing. It would benefit the country overall. So even a benevolent government, benevolent planner would want to put tariffs in these types of circumstances. So does that mean that we should all be putting tariffs? And the answer is no, because tariffs are a special kind of tax that can tax you back, right? So in all of these arguments that I went through, one thing I didn't mention is that as a country that puts on the tariff experiences an increase in welfare, its trading partner, the country that is experiencing the tariff, is actually worse off, right? So from the world perspective, all of these policies are bad. If you instead of taking the welfare of the country itself that puts on the tariff, and you looked at the welfare of the world, in all of these cases, you would discover that the world is worse off from these tariffs. And then the foreign country that is now having to pay these tariffs is also worse off. That follows directly. And what is the problem? The problem is that then the foreign country can do that same thing to you, right? So other taxes, think about income taxes, consumption taxes, capital gain taxes, et cetera, that are domestic, they cannot tax you back, right? You put them and then you collect the revenue and that it ends there. Whereas tariffs are taxes in other countries and other countries can tax you back. That's what is unique about tariffs among taxes. And when both countries do that, they both end up being worse off, right? So we end up in something called the prisoner's dilemma, which, you know, if you studied economics or political science, you would be familiar with this. So imagine there are two countries, and they can either put a tariff on the other one, the trading partner, or they can put no tariff. And when each country thinks about it selfishly, in terms of its own optimal strategy, it is going to choose to put a tariff no matter what the other country does, right? So if country one is putting no tariff, country two thinks, okay, if I put no tariff, if I put no tariff, I'm going to be in free trade. The payoff here is normalized to zero. But if I put a tariff, I gain because I have an optimal tariff on country one, right? And country one thinks the same thing. It thinks that no matter what the country two is doing, I actually am going to gain by putting the tariffs. But when they both think selfishly, they end up in an equilibrium where they both lose. So this is the prisoner's dilemma outcome. So in a sense, without kind of anything else, without anything more, countries acting selfishly are going to end up in a regime in which they both put tariffs on each other, but then they're both worse off than if they had free trade. So this prisoner's dilemma outcome, where both countries lose, is a good way to think about what was happening to tariffs in the interwar period. In the interwar period, tariffs were high everywhere. And I think it's widely recognized that countries were worse off from having these mutually high tariffs. So how do you get around that bad outcome? You get around it with trade negotiations, right? You get together and you commit to mutual tariff reductions to get you from this mutual loss outcome to a positive free trade outcome. And that is indeed what happened after World War II. So even before World War II ended, the countries that were going to win the war got together at the famous Bretton Woods Conference in 1944. Bretton Woods is a resort in New Hampshire, to hammer out the global economic framework that was going to govern the world economy after the war ended. And that produced the agreements to found the IMF, the World Bank, and eventually the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, which was finally founded in 1947 in Geneva. That's the right picture. And this General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade was a forum for negotiating mutual tariff reductions to get the world out of the bad tariff equilibrium that it was in. And it was a tremendously successful effort. So on the right here is a picture of the GATT / WTO membership and the amount of trade. The GATT in 1995 became the WTO, the World Trade Organization. And you see that its membership expanded from something like 20 countries in the beginning. So the blue area is the number of countries that are members of the GATT / WTO. So this membership increased from something like 20 countries to something like 160 countries today. And just for comparison, the solid black line is the amount of trade that happens within the WTO member countries. And then the dashed line is the amount of trade that happens outside of the WTO countries. And you see it's self-evident the comparison between the two. Right? The vast majority of world trade is now between WTO countries. The WTO negotiated tariffs through successive rounds. And here the vertical lines are the different rounds of WTO negotiation. I will just flag that the last round is the Doha round, which unfortunately has not come to any resolution so far. It started in 2001. And then in parallel to that there were also a tremendous number of regional trade agreements that were signed. So right now, there's about 400 regional trade agreements in place. Regional trade agreement is sometimes also called preferential trade agreement, is an agreement to free trade between smaller set of countries than the world. So one prominent one is the European Union. It's obviously much more than a trade agreement, but it's partly a trade agreement that has tariff-free or any kind of barrier-free trade between the European Union countries. NAFTA is another one, which is the trade agreement between US, Canada, and Mexico. But as you can see, there are many more. There's 400 of these. So countries overcame this difficulty of tariffs being individually optimal, but collectively self-defeating. Countries overcame that over the past few decades by getting together and cooperating on trade, negotiating trade barrier reductions. And as we saw in the first slide, that was tremendously successful at promoting international trade and lowering trade barriers. So what does that leave out today? I hope I convinced you that free trade is not the natural state of the world, in spite of most of our lived experience kind of suggesting that it is. It's actually not. And the hyper-globalization period that we lived through in recent years is actually a rare exception and not the rule in the historical record. And I hope that I also helped you understand why that is. And the reason is that free trade is inherently fragile. It's a fragile equilibrium, right? It relies on cooperation, sustained cooperation, without which it will fall apart. And so U.S. has in 2025 forcefully broke with this cooperative regime, and it essentially exited free trade. Now, you can see that in some myopic sense, it's optimal. I told you that if a country acting alone is going to put tariffs, it's in its self-interest. There's nothing kind of malicious about it or even misguided in the first level, right? It only becomes misguided once we reach the full equilibrium where other countries play their optimal strategy against the US, which is to put tariffs against the US. So China has done that. It has done that every step, right? It did it in 2018. It also did it in 2025. Sometimes it's misperceived as kind of like vengeful or revenge or is doing something self-defeating just to spite the US or to kind of signal its strength. But no, actually, like very pedestrian optimal tariff argument would say that once the US exited the free trade regime, it is now optimal for China, anger or not, to then do the same for the US. So to me, the mystery is not why China retaliates. I can understand very well why it retaliates. To me, the mystery is why other countries don't retaliate. Right? In particular, very large blocs like the EU. The EU collectively has a larger economy than the US. So I would think that the optimal strategy for the EU, now that the US exited a trade cooperation, is also to put tariffs on the US. it hasn't happened for reasons that I think are outside of economics. I cannot find an economic reason why the EU would not put tariffs on the US at this point. But political scientists here can speak much more eloquently on this, but I would imagine that it has to do with the configuration of military power in the world and Europe's desire to use the US as a defensive ally. So going forward, there's one key question in my mind, which is what happens to world trade and the world trade cooperation equilibrium elsewhere in the world now that the US has exited free trade? And that's something that we don't really know much about. These problems of multilateral games between countries and so on are hard to analyze. So there's nothing in the economics literature that I could find that would tell me, for example, now that the US exited the free trade regime, is cooperation among the other countries in the world going to be easier or harder to sustain? We actually don't know. I'm actually working on a paper about that now. So can the WTO, for example, reorganize itself and survive the US sabotage of the organization? Can it sort of like cauterize the US somehow and move forward as an organization in which the US is de-emphasized? And will other countries resist the temptation to protect their economies with tariffs, not just against the US, but also against other countries who are not necessarily in a trade war with them, right? So for example, there are many news articles about EU and China, right? Now that US is not a market for Chinese goods, some of these goods are going to Europe, and then Europe is becoming nervous and deliberating putting tariffs on Chinese goods. This would be a domino effect that comes from these US policies affecting trade relationships of countries that are not directly involved with the US. So to me, that is the big question. Can the free trade survive outside of the US now that the US has exited the free trade regime? So I will stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrei, for the very insightful and rich presentations. And now we open the floor for questions. Okay, I'll start with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Dr. Hamid. Sorry. Yes.
Thank you so much, Andrew, for this excellent presentation. Because I was expecting that going to be models, and I was just thinking, and it was very informative, and it's clear to even non-economists. It's very good. But the question that I have regarding, we're talking from the trade angle of the tariffs, but there is geopolitical changes. The regional alliances are switching. And basically, not the US is exiting the globalization, rather than repositioning itself to the places that are likely to be more fertile for the future growth of the US economy. Because you look at the Ukrainian negotiation, they are talking about the rare minerals. And also they are trying to come to Africa for the rare minerals. And the competition with China on the basically the chips production and etc. So that's probably one of the things that might worth it to focus. The other thing that on the Nash equilibrium thing, because it seems that is there the optimal tax, there is somebody's lose, somebody's gaining. But there is a 0-0 that you put it over there. It shouldn't be 0-0. If there is no tariffs, both of them are likely to gain if we go with the trade. The other one is the one that looks like a Laffer curve about the importers' welfare. There is a free trade and no trade. if you make it no trade, we're supposed to go to the point of origins. I was rather seeing that is post-prohibited tariffs, post-tariffs rather than no trade. That's what's likely to be trade post-tariff type of a thing rather than no trade. And that's my point.
Thank you, Doctor. So we take a couple of questions, maybe when I just write them down. I think there is a, okay. So we go with Dr. Abdul Wahab and then Dr. Elias.
Thank you, Andrei, for the interesting expose. I am an illiterate economist, but a few years back I was doing an analysis of the war between Eritrea and Ethiopia. And as a political scientist, of course, I was looking for the political tensions and so on and so on. But as I progressed with my research and I was doing interviews, I realized that the main cause for the war was the economic integration between Ethiopia and Eritrea, because they started as one country, one currency, one free market, one central bank, but politically they were two states. So the economic integration became disadvantageous for Eritrea because it doesn't have control over the central bank, it doesn't have control over the currency. But then Ethiopia started to put restrictions on trade. For example, anything which is exportable, they do not allow Eritrea to buy, even if they have the money. And so this tension kept mounting. And I studied also, because in Eastern Africa, there was also a similar experience before that, which was the Eastern African Union, which was also, the British left it as one economic region with one central bank, single currency, free trade, even one university and one airline. Again, and that takes us to the tariff issue, because of the Union, which similar to the European Union, even as more advanced than it at that time, because Europe came to the single currency and single bank later. Kenya was the most economically developed country. So it was the one exporting to its neighbors, and the neighbors all recently formed countries depending mainly on tariffs for their finances. So they were unable now to collect tariffs from Kenya, and so their economies were in trouble. So tariffs did have a function. So very soon that union integrated and actually ended in conflicts and a war between Uganda and Tanzania at one point. So my question is this. At that time, this looked to me as a prediction of what would happen in Europe. But Europe has an advantage in that they were compensating the countries which lose from the Union, because the European Union has got lots of money, so they could give. And I think now that also could explain what's happening in America. America is suffering from globalization, and maybe the reason why China doesn't want to retaliate is that China is still benefiting. The deficit which you have with America is quite large. So they want to lose that surplus of money from America. But this is my 2 cents in the issue, on the issue.
Thank you, Dr. Do we take one more question and then, so we take a group of 3 questions every time? Okay, Dr. Elias.
Yes, I enjoyed the talk. Is it?
Yeah.
I want to pose two issues which they seem unrelated, but they are related, and that is you mentioned that something outside economics. You brought up the issue that why the EU is not retaliating while China is, and you talked about the international alliance, geopolitics, and which is outside economics. Now, the two issues, the first one is that if we look at the current account balance for the U.S., because the U.S. is exiting the free trade. Starting in the early 80s, the saving rate in the United States became lower than the investment rate by 3%. And this went up all to 6% out of the, in relation to GDP. During the global financial crisis. Now it's about 4% difference between saving and investment. Now this is something worrying for long-term planners in the US. That means foreigners are buying more and more of the US. Now as a country with boundary, and we have many political scientists here who talk about there are countries and boundaries, is that if you leave this alone, eventually foreigners would own the US, and as a result, United States would lose its autonomy, even not as a superpower, just becomes like any other banana republic. So the competition between countries is something, we talk a lot about trade, but the question is really the state is really defined by its geography, and geography is very important. And this is bring me to the second question about geography, is that if we start with Adam Smith, Wealth of Nations, division of labor, and great idea about division of labor is that there is economies of scale, saving on fixed cost. So the idea is that if we have two countries in the world and each one just specialize in making one good, they could really increase well-being for everybody just by the absolute advantage of economies of by just the economies of using the fixed cost. The problem with this picture is again geography. Is that geographically not all countries are moving in the same direction through time. So some countries are more advanced than others in terms of technology, and as a result there could be a gap widening among countries, which some think that Dr. Abdul Wahab Effendi mentioned about Eritrea and Ethiopia. And the other example that he used with Kenya is the idea is that if you have a starting point which is not equal, then you have to think about the process of time, what happens to a widening gap that might not be abridged as a result of the economies of scale that Adam Smith talked about. Thank you.
We'll just let Andrea answer the question, then we'll take a second round. Okay.
Thank you very much Thank you very much for all the insightful questions. So let me take it from the top. So yeah, I agree that other things are changing, and in particular this geopolitical forces are somehow back. I think it's not like we're strangers to these types of considerations. Before the end of Cold War, the world looked a lot like it does now, except even more extreme, where countries were competing for spheres of influence very explicitly, and to some extent, part of that was to control resources. Then that went away in the era of globalization and kind of free market, but now it's back. but again, I mean, in some sense, this isn't new. And as economists, we don't study it that much. I think it's probably a consequence of the fact that, again, for the past few decades, it just wasn't all that important. But we are starting to study that now. There's a lot we don't understand about geopolitics as economists. I mean, maybe political scientists understand it very well, but as economists, we don't. In particular, even basic questions like why do countries engage in these costly geopolitical actions, we don't often know. I can answer more specific questions about the payoff matrix and so on, I think a little bit later. Yeah, so thank you for the intervention about these case studies in Africa. Obviously, you know much more about them than I do. It seems like what you were, so in that sense, I cannot really comment in detail. It seems like what you were alluding to were collective action failures by the different groups inside the countries or inside the groups of countries that essentially could not allocate resources optimally and therefore had to either go to war or had to break up. Those are very interesting issues. And thinking more narrowly about the tariffs, as I mentioned, there are probably tariffs in the real world that are imposed for reasons that have to do with collective action failures. For example, tariffs that are due to influence of special interests that are detrimental to the welfare of the country as a whole, but are there because special interests captured the political process. And I wanted to kind of explicitly set that aside and focus on bigger pictures and focus on cases in which tariffs are, even from a benevolent social planner's view, are kind of at least myopically welfare improving. So then there were a couple of questions about the U.S., the impact of globalization on the U.S., and then the U.S. current account deficit. You know, these are really subtle issues that I think do not really admit an easy type of analysis. I think the statement that America is suffering from globalization, I mean, I would dispute that statement in the sense that I think there is no evidence that America as a whole lost from participating in international trade over the last few decades. There's evidence that perhaps some specific locations and specific industries have shrunk, and clearly there's locations there's locations where people have suffered, and that suffering can be at least partly, but perhaps not entirely. Yeah, I'll talk about it in a second. Attributed to globalization, but truthfully, we don't really know how much. Right? There's U.S. Rust Belt shrinking and so on. How much of it is attributable to globalization? We don't know. That's the honest truth. There are other forces at play, like technological change, like structural change, the fact that the U.S. is becoming a service economy, so manufacturing would shrink even in the absence of any kind of international trade over time. So I would dispute the claim that the U.S. has suffered from globalization. I think it gained quite a bit from globalization as a whole. And then the current account deficit is another very subtle issue. I mean, people have spent careers trying to understand the U.S. current account deficit and whether there's anything bad about it. And it's inconclusive. There's nothing kind of inherently wrong with running a persistent current account deficit, especially in the U.S. case. The U.S. earns much more on its own foreign assets than it pays to foreigners on its foreign liabilities, which means that kind of time and time again, it receives transfers from the rest of the world that it can use to consume without really going further into debt to the rest of the world. So I don't think, even if things were allowed to continue, we would reach the point at which foreigners own the U.S. anytime soon, realistically. So I understand the queasiness. So I'm not a specialist in current account. I understand the queasiness about running a current account deficit for 30 years, there's like a feeling that there's something wrong and there's some failure behind it. But the truth is that even people who have spent their entire life studying it still cannot tell you, okay, this is terrible, this is wrong. It's a very subtle issue. So yes, one way to close the current account deficit is to stop trading. That's one easy way. On balance, is it going to be a good thing for the US? I don't really think so. But again, I'm not an expert in current account. And then the final question about trade in the presence of a significant gap in development. I mean, there are layers to this question. The first layer says that gains from trade are going to occur because of specialization according to comparative advantage as opposed to absolute advantage. So in principle, even if two countries have a massive technological gap in absolute terms, as long as they have a comparative advantage, so some country is relatively better at producing a good than another, they're still going to gain. There's kind of nothing wrong with a poorer country trading with a much richer country. It's still going to benefit. But I understand that that's just the first layer, and then there are many stories about how certain types of international trade are going to hold back development. I alluded to some of them when I discussed the infant industry argument, right? So it could be that it's bad to specialize in agriculture because it doesn't put you on the ladder towards higher productivity growth in the future, and perhaps we should have countries try to affect their specialization pattern towards manufacturing. There are certainly some success stories to that effect, like, for example, South Korea in the 70s. I'm sympathetic to those kinds of arguments. So, you know, it's possible that trading with a country, if you're a poor country trading with a country that's much, much more developed than you, could in the long run have some detrimental effects. I'm sympathetic to that in principle.
Okay, thank you. We take another round of questions. We start with Dr. Hassan and then with Ahmed. Dr. Hassan.
Thank you very much. Enjoyed the presentation, and I just have a couple of comments. One about the justification for imposing the tariff for the taxis. The one about the infant industry, because we lived it in this part of the region. The infant industry argument has turned out practically to be a very bad one. What happened, it's very logical in terms of saying, okay, we have a very young industry. We cannot actually put it in the field to play with the big boys. This infant is going to be killed if you put it in the world market. So there was a lot of very nice metaphoric things. But what I tell my student, that the infant, because of these prohibitive taxes that was put in, grow up to be a very spoiled child. Not only that, but it even existed for 15, 20 years. Infant industry should be temporarily, shouldn't be permanent. And after 15, 20 years, the people who were running these companies, public companies, so to speak, went to jail because they were just trying to keep seeking the rent all the time. So the infant actually became a teenager who was committing crimes because you keep spoiling this brat. So in practicality, it was a very bad argument. For the US, not only what my colleague Elias said about the lower saving rate. Actually, in 2005, the saving rate in the US was negative. And the only time it was negative, it was in the 1929. So I wrote 3 articles in a newspaper at the time about this issue. I can send it to you. And I predicted that something will happen, which is 2 years later, the Great Recession happened. This is amazingly true right now. You know, it has improved a little bit. It reached actually the highest, about 9%. But what is the saving rate right now? It's only 4.5% in the US. Comparing with the Chinese or the Indian, who reach 30%, you know now why these are not even competing with it. The idea of Adam Smith is not the scale, it's the efficiency. You're talking about comparative advantage. And by using the very simple example of comparative advantage, if you specialize in the area where you have relative efficiency, you're going to produce much more. When you produce more and then you trade, you will increase the welfare. So definitely, you don't need all the hassle about why the trade is useful. The trade is very useful. You are killing the world welfare by imposing such taxes because you are allowing the inefficient industry in the US, and you're going to experience this 10 years from now, to grow up and be a spoiled child. That's it. I'm seeing it very, very much happening. So one more time, the idea of this deficit and this mismatch is the US is using its position as the universal currency in the world. This is the main difference. The dollar as a universal currency is giving the US economy huge advantage. As you probably, or I'm sure that you know, 2/3 of the US money supply is outside. So you have huge demand on the dollar that is not supported by the local production. It's supported by the world production. So it costs the US about 20 cents to produce the $100. So you're giving this paper of $100 to Qatar, Saudi Arabia, whatever, and you're getting the goods. And you are paying, you are right, you are paying much less for the money that you are borrowing. The US economy is financed by the saving of the other country. So this disparity is going to take effect rather now very quickly because Mr. Trump is shooting himself in the foot. And the economy is going to lose the confidence. The US currency is basically exchange in the world because of the confidence in the economy. Now, when you are shaking that confidence, the dollar is going to lose the attractiveness, moving to another whatever digital currency or whatever, and you will see that the US economy is going to collapse if this is continue to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Hassan. Yeah, go ahead, Ahmed. Speak, maybe it's working.
Okay, thank you, Professor, for this very informative lecture. I have two questions. So, if free trade is a prisoner dilemma, so the solution is to change the rules of the game. So the question is, how can we fix our supranational institutions like WTO to maintain the transparent, effective, multilateral trade system if we consider trade as a public good? The second question is how to increase political demand through rhetoric, through pro-trade narrative, to convince citizens to demand free trade. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ahmed. Ahmed is a student at the Development Economics program. So we need more questions from students and political scientists as well. We want you to challenge us. Dr. Ibrahim.
Here is something from conflict and political science. And it's a quick question. I'm glad you mentioned the prisoner's dilemma. And the prisoner's dilemma in conflict resolution, it's solved by introducing a trust between the parties. What solves it here? Thank you.
So I can take one more question before we end the questions. So Dr. Salah.
Thank you very much for the great talk. Just to return back to infant industry protection, and you brought up Friedrich List. His argument actually, and back to Dr. Hassan's point, wasn't to keep it protected forever. It was until it was competitive. So I guess you mentioned you're sympathetic to the fact that if we take the comparative advantage logic, which actually was David Ricardo and Adam Smith picked up on it, we're actually asking countries to specialize in being poor, right? And just trade with rich countries, as opposed to developing and industrializing, essentially. So I guess, just briefly, I wanted to ask you what your thoughts are, or are you sympathetic to the argument that, well, eventually you do need to protect your industries to allow yourself to kind of climb up on the ladder? Thank you.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you again for a set of insightful questions. So the first and the last one was about the infant industry argument and this idea that it went badly most of the time that it was tried. So you mentioned the Gulf. I don't know in detail the Gulf experience, but certainly
well, Egypt. That's Egypt. He's from Egypt.
Okay. Sorry. I thought I heard the Gulf. Anyway, yeah, but so the last question, I think you put your finger exactly on the tension in some sense, which is that on the one hand, there is something to this argument that countries may get stuck in a development trap by specializing too much in industries that are not conducive to long-run growth. I don't consider that argument completely settled. I know it has gone on for decades, at least going back to Prebisch and Singer in the 50s and 60s. But there are very rich countries who are agricultural and resource exporters. We can think about Canada. We can think about the Gulf countries. And there's some very poor countries that are natural resource and agricultural exporters. So I don't think that debate is really settled. But it does have some ring of truth to it, in my opinion. So on the one hand, I think there is something to this idea, broadly speaking, of industrial policy and trying to affect the course of development. I think the East Asian miracle economies all engaged in very active industrial policy. And we can debate causality, we can debate whether they would have developed anyway. I don't really know, but it seems like it helped them. I'm talking about South Korea, Taiwan, and then eventually China. I think it helped them to be thoughtful about which industries they want to specialize in and what is going to be the most conducive to their long-run growth, on the one hand. And on the other hand is I think, broadly speaking, worldwide, a record of tremendous failure of infant industry protection. I think this import substituting industrialization was tried in South America, was tried in Africa, and it mostly failed. So I think it's actually very hard to take this idea that I may want to develop certain industries and invest in certain industries and make it operational and make it work for you. So I think it works in kind of special circumstances. It works when you pick the right industries. It fails when you pick the wrong industries. And it's a very narrow path. Like, you can make an economic case that it's welfare improving to protect some industries temporarily, as was mentioned. But it's a very narrow case, and I think it mostly failed. I do agree that, you know, ironically, the infinite industry argument is now back in the U.S., which is a great irony indeed. Okay, so then there were a couple more points about the U.S. Exorbitant privilege and the fact that the U.S. the U.S. dollar is the dominant currency. I agree with all of that, and I do think that you know, the analysis that says that this is actually bad for the U.S. I think is wrong. So there's this famous essay by Stephen Myron, who was in the Trump team, that said that U.S. exorbitant privilege leads to a persistent dollar devaluation, which leads to the shrinking of the U.S. industry. I mean, yeah, that's an interesting argument, but I don't think that that's it's the first order thing. I think the first order thing is that year after year, other countries in the world are transferring resources to the U.S. In return for this safe asset that the U.S. Is providing. So I'm completely on board with all of what you said. And then there was a set of questions about the prisoner's dilemma outcome, WTO. Yes, so I think, like at a technical level, right, the way you get into the good outcome of the prisoner's dilemma game is in an infinitely repeated game, where it becomes an equilibrium for both of us to cooperate, in the promise that we will keep cooperating in the future indefinitely, right? And that's why WTO is so useful, because WTO creates this framework to enforce to some extent this cooperation going forward and the commitment to cooperation in the future. And the WTO now is at an impasse because it has this dispute resolution mechanism that requires panels of judges, part of which U.S. appoints, and the U.S. has refused to appoint new judges after the old judges' terms have run out. And so the WTO dispute resolution mechanism is now not operative. And to me, the big question is whether the WTO can really move on with its business without the U.S. I mean, there's kind of institutional impediments to it, because the U.S. is also a large shareholder, and so or an important player in the WTO decision making, and so how we can kind of cauterize the U.S. and move on, I think is the big question going forward. And I agree with you. I agree with you on that. And finally, I think it's a terrific question about the political demand for free trade. Yeah, no, I think we might have noticed that Biden did not actually take down any of the Trump tariffs. So it's not like, oh, you know, there's Trump and he's over there by himself, and in fact, somewhere in the background there's consensus for free trade in the U.S. society. No, actually, somehow we ended up with this anti-trade consensus that I think is misguided. But there's no political force in the U.S. Political spectrum right now who is arguing for free trade, which I think is problematic. And I don't know what the answer to that is. I think from an individual politician perspective, it would be self-defeating to come out in favor of free trade now. And I'm afraid that we're just going to have to let things play out a little bit and see, you know, have the U.S. population become disillusioned on its own with the way things are going.
Okay, Dr. Aziz.
If I may be allowed a simple question. Okay. Yes, everyone has been talking economics. Now, of course, this is all in the present conjuncture overlaid by geostrategic considerations, particularly with regard to tariffs against China. The competition is, of course, not only economic competition. There's a huge, there's a broad range of things. At the same time, we have a situation where there is a kind of economic siege on Russia, the sanctions regime, which is an international regime, resulting in the disruption of all lines of communication, energy supplies, quite a lot of things. So we have a very, very complex, picture of international economic transactions or of trade transactions, including sanctions, which then, of course, inhibit trade in any shape or form. Do you see a composite picture? A composite political picture, a political economic picture, which might in itself then stymie or trump, to use a wonderful verb, or trump the economic logic which may be operative in tariff regimes.
Okay, this is our final question, unless there are any other urgent, really pressing questions. Okay, so this is our final question.
Still on? Yes. Thank you for the question. I think as a field in economics, we are rushing to try to understand this now. I think that this return of geopolitics has blindsided us as a field to some extent, and we're grappling with this now, and hopefully we'll progress as a field. But in a sense, we're not greatly equipped. We're not all that well equipped to answer these types of questions, because economics is to a large extent based on analyzing voluntary exchange between either people or companies or countries. And so when we start talking about things like military conquest, as economists, we're like deer in the headlights. It's hard for us. I mean, there are certain pockets in economics that study these types of things, but we certainly need to progress as a field in that direction now. But yes, if it ends up being that there are actors in the world economy that are whose main objective is conquest, and countries, whether it's Eastern Europe or Taiwan or perhaps some other places, have to essentially fear for their safety, that's a whole different ballgame. We're not talking about, okay, should we trade or not, and we're in a very different regime that would require different tools to analyze.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Andrea. Thank you for your questions as well. With this comes the end of our opening lecture. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Andrea. That was very insightful.
Thank you.